Jerusalem in the 21st century, the flashpoint of geopolitics today, as it has been from time immemorial. Though united under Israeli rule since 1967, the facts on the ground are nonetheless evidence of two Jerusalems, one Jewish, one Arab. It is in the sleepy Arab suburb of Silwan that the fragile modus vivendi of the two hostile populations is being threatened by, of all things, an archaeological dig. Incredibly, the ground beneath has given up over years of excavation the remains of what might well be the palace of none other than King David, Israel's first great king, whose praises are chanted in the streets of the holy city even to this day. It's also the focus of another conflict, this one between competing scholarly camps in the ever-changing field of biblical archaeology. To be sure, King David has quite a few detractors these days. Not only is he lambasted for his bloody misdeeds and personal peccadillos recorded in the Bible, but a good number of contemporary archaeologists cast doubt on his very existence. If he did exist, so they say, he was probably little more than a local chieftain dwelling in a tent somewhere, and the tales about him are likely no more reliable than those about, say, King Arthur and his famous round table. But we should also recognize that this is more than just a debate among ivory tower academics. It has real-life consequences for the state of Israel today. Because believe it or not, if David goes, a lot goes with him. That includes the very identity of the multitude of Israelis who call Jerusalem their home and who fervently believe that the city they inhabit was the capital of David's kingdom, just as it is the capital of today's Jewish state. The naysayers certainly make valid points. One prominent camp of archaeologists argue that there never was a united kingdom under David or any of his descendants, much less was there ever an Israelite empire representing a regional power in the ancient Near East. There are only two squabbling Israelite kingdoms, the inhabitants of which simply fantasized that once upon a time they had been united under a great and noble king. For many long centuries, most people simply assumed that if a story is in the Bible, it must be true. In the early 19th century, the renowned American archaeologist and explorer Edward Robinson trekked across the Holy Land in search of biblical sites. Convinced that the grandeur of King David's Jerusalem must have been something to behold, he was fairly shocked to witness the extent to which the city had declined. He wrote, "Jerusalem is still in all its features an oriental city, in its closeness and filth, and its stagnation in moral darkness. It was again difficult to realize that this indeed had been the splendid capital of David and Solomon, in honor of which Hebrew poets and prophets poured forth their inspired strains, where the God of Israel was said to dwell on earth and manifested his glory in the temple. Robinson certainly noted references to David all over the city in monuments still seen today. Historians speak of the tower or citadel of David and describe it as built of large hewn stones and of immense strength. He also made reference to David's tomb. The sepulchre of David and his descendants, as we know, were upon Mount Zion. They were called, apparently, the sepulchre of the sons of David, and also of the kings of Israel, and were still extant in the times of the apostles. How things have changed in the course of the last century and a half. Nowadays, at least among the scholarly community, it's assumed more often than not that if it's in the Bible, it must not be true, it must be false. Indeed, there's a lot to be skeptical about. The Citadel of David, with its imposing tower, wasn't built by David at all. Rather, it's largely an Ottoman structure from the 1500s, with various elements dating to the Mamluk, Muslim, Byzantine, and Herodian age. And the name Tower of David can't be traced back any earlier than the 5th century. As for the tomb of David, we can visit it today on the sacred hill known as Mount Zion, except this isn't really David's tomb. It's another medieval structure, which before Israel's 1948 War of Independence was a mosque, and before that, a church. At the time of King David, the hill now known as Mount Zion was an uninhabited area far outside the city walls. The real Mount Zion lay to the east, across a valley. That's where the real David would have been buried, if he existed at all. But looking back at the beginning of his career, David's first action after consolidating power will be to attack the Canaanite stronghold of Jebus, a move undertaken for purely political reasons. David recognizes that in order to hold a confederacy together, a centrally located capital will be a key ingredient. He and his general, Joab, attack the Jebusites by stealth, gaining entrance to the city via an underground water channel that cuts directly beneath the walls and fortified towers. The unsuspecting inhabitants are taken by surprise and promptly massacred. David, of course, is never one to shrink from bloodshed. Can archaeology perhaps verify this account? And with it, the existence of the historical David? At the end of October 1867, Sir Charles Warren, an officer in the British Royal Engineers and one of the earliest European archaeologists of the Holy Land, explored a hand-chiseled conduit leading from Jerusalem's ancient water source, the Gihon Spring. Warren recorded the adventure in his journal. It was easy walking until we reached 600 feet into the tunnel. Then we began crawling on all fours. As we saw bits of cabbage stalks floating by, we realized that the waters had started to rise. There I was, with a pencil, compass, and field book in my hands, and the candle, for the most part, in my mouth. My companion and I had just 4 inches of breathing space. When observing, my mouth was underwater. Where the tunnel began at the spring, I noticed that the water first collected in an underground, cave-like chamber. With the help of my team and local Arab workers, we cleaned out the cave and found the entrance to a tunnel. We followed it for 40 feet, where it ended in a curious shaft, which rose into the darkness above our heads. A few days later, we returned to climb the shaft. By jamming the boards against the side of the shaft, we succeeded in getting up 20 feet. on lighting a piece of magnesium wire we could see 20 feet above us. A piece of loose masonry impending directly above our heads. And as several loose pieces had been found at the bottom, it occurred to both of us that our position was critical. Without speaking of it, we eyed each other ominously and wished we were a little higher up. We kept climbing to find another tunnel at the top of the shaft and a series of caves leading up towards a blocked entrance. Slowly, it dawned on us that we had unearthed a hidden water system leading to the spring from somewhere on the southeastern ridge. This, coupled with the ancient wall and the tunnel leading to the pool of Siloam, had striking implications. It meant that there had definitely been a settlement outside the city medieval walls. At 900 feet into the tunnel, we discovered false turns and began to go in a zigzag direction. It was here that I inadvertently swallowed part of my lead pencil, nearly choking. When we came out shivering, it was dark. We had been nearly 4 hours in the water. It took another 100 years for the full meaning of Warren's discovery to be grasped. The most ancient part of Jerusalem was, in fact, outside what we call today the old city walls. It was located on the ridge to the southeast, not far from the water source. If there were a David, this is the place he would have called home. Nonetheless, Charles Warren's water system, known today as Warren's Shaft, appears not to be made by human hands, as it was assumed for over a century, but is rather a natural limestone sinkhole. It's unlikely that David would have entered the city in this way. The excavations Warren began were destined to continue over the next 100+ years, and the final verdict has yet to be delivered. But in the last few years of the 20th century, reconstruction work beneath a new visitor center being erected in the vicinity uncovered an unknown tunnel. It led from the main tunnel to another feeding pool, affording free access and bypassing Warren's Shaft entirely. Pottery dating to between 2000 and 1550 before the Common Era, well before the time of David, was also recovered in this tunnel. What this means is that just as Warren's Shaft seemed to be debunked, another candidate for David's secret tunnel appeared. Could the Bible's version of the city's conquest be spot on after all? Returning to the biblical record, we're told that following David's stealthy victory, the city will henceforth be known as Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, the city of peace. From this moment, Jerusalem will play a central role in Jewish history from generation to generation. It will also become a major point of contention in world geopolitics. Unfortunately, perhaps as part of David's legacy, peace is something it will never know. David was arguably a man with just the right qualities for ruling in a brutal age, but the painful truth is that he wants absolute power. His major policy goal is to conquer the entire land of Canaan, which none of the previous judges was ever able to accomplish. The Israelite ruler sets his sights on Transjordan in the east, conquering the kingdoms of both Moab and Edom. He finds himself ruling over both major trade routes in the region, the Via Maris, hugging the Mediterranean coast from Egypt, and the King's Highway, passing through the eastern desert. We're even told that he conquers Damascus itself and extends his realm all the way to the Euphrates River. Tradition would have us believe that Israel reaches a high point of military and political dominance under David, becoming a major power in the ancient Near East. Can archaeology substantiate any of this? Or are the minimalists on target in deeming all of the biblical account fantasy? In 1993, in northern Galilee, near Israel's border with Lebanon, a most amazing artifact was unearthed. It happened during a decades-long excavation of the ancient site known as Tel Dan. One of the diggers suddenly shouted that he had found something. It was a basalt stone engraved with ancient Hebrew lettering. It was apparently erected by an unnamed ruler to commemorate his conquests, among them a certain king of Israel, plainly visible in one of the lines. One line beneath, two Hebrew words were destined to grab the world's attention. Beit David, the house of David. Everything about it points to a date of the 9th century, less than 150 years after David himself. Of course, it doesn't refer to David, only his house. But how could there possibly have been a house of David if there had been no David? Of course, the minimalists have tried to dismiss it, since the Hebrew letters spelling David, David, can also be read as Dod, meaning uncle. But with the phrase King of Israel right above it, why would it then talk about an uncle's house? Some have even gone so far as to suggest that it's a forgery. But the very idea that the elderly Israeli archaeologist in charge of the dig was in reality an arch forger seems absurd to most. Bottom line, this stone slab is the closest thing we have to a smoking gun in the battle for David. We still have no evidence of any kind that David extended his empire as far as the Euphrates River. But if we count this inscription as authentic, he made it at least as far as northern Galilee. Oddly enough, archaeology provides yet more evidence of David via an account of the rumblings of revolt against his descendants. It's related on a black basalt monument discovered by an Anglican minister named F.A. Klein, who came to the Holy Land as a medical missionary in the mid-1800s. On August 19, 1868, Klein stopped at the campsite of a Bedouin tribe about 3 miles north of the Arnon River, where biblical Dibon was located. While there, I learned from the Bedouin of Dibon of an inscribed stone laying in the nearby ruins of this ancient city. I asked to be taken to the stone, and my Bedouin friends gladly obliged. While I did not realize it at the time, I was looking at the longest monumental stone inscription from ancient times that had ever come to light anywhere in Palestine. Today, it is known as the Moabite stone, or the Mesha stele. When I first saw the stone, it was lying on its back with the inscription face up. I lifted the stone to see if there was any writing on the back. There was none. Unable to read the inscription, I made a sketch of the monument and copied a few of the characters in my notebook. I then negotiated with the Bedouin for the purchase of the stone and obtained their oral agreement to sell it for 100 Napoleons. That was about $400 at the time. As for the precise content of the Moabite stone, it's another kingly stele boasting of conflict with David's house, dating from about 860 before the Common Era. The script is Phoenician, sometimes called Paleo-Hebrew. The text of the inscription refers to King Mesha's successful Moabite rebellion against and military victory over the Israelites. Laying out the nature of the grievance, the stone declares, "As for the king of Israel, He humbled Moab for many years. Later, the stone relates that the house of David dwelt in Haranen. It's there in plain Hebrew. And again we ask, how could there have been a house of David if there had been no David? Flash forward to the 20th century. In the 1960s, British archaeologist Dame Kathleen Kenyon began excavating at a hilly outcropping directly to the south of the Temple Mount, called the Ophel. Unlike the hill today, incorrectly called Mount Zion, this is the authentic location of David's ancient city, assuming, of course, that there even was a David. There she found a portion of a stepped stone structure that she thought was part of a casemate wall. That is, two parallel walls divided by perpendicular walls. Built by King Solomon in the 10th century before the Common Era. Kenyon was unmistakable in her appearance, dressed in faded old clothes, chain smoking, with a ubiquitous dog trailing at her heels. Never appearing particularly intellectual, she was warm, enthusiastic, and charming. Decades later, Israeli archaeologist Eilat Mazar of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem began wondering whether Kenyon's casemate wall was in fact part of David's palace, outside of the Jebusite city, a possibility Kenyon never even considered. That's when archaeology and the aims of a politically motivated group of Israeli settlers suddenly converged. It just so happens that in the mid-1980s, when a commander of an elite unit of the Israel Defense Force, David Be'eri, visited this part of Greater Jerusalem, he found that the specific locations of past digs were covered with garbage and waste. He subsequently left the military to establish the Ir David, or City of David Foundation, commonly known as El-Ad, a Hebrew acronym standing for El Ir David, and which means to the city of David. Its purpose? To retrieve and restore the city's ancient heritage. To advance this goal, the El-Ad Foundation helped fund a new excavation at the summit of the city of David, headed by Eilat Mazar on behalf of the Institute of Archaeology of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The Israel Antiquities Authority oversaw the excavation, but the site itself was mostly funded and operated by El-Ad. In 2005, Mazar's excavations of the city of David uncovered a massive structure that she dated to the 10th century before the Common Era. Its sheer size is just what we'd expect in a great centralized kingdom, ruled by a king dated by the biblical account to exactly this time frame, David. Could this be the remains of the actual palace of King David? Could it prove that, far from being a local chieftain dwelling in a tent, he was more or less exactly who the Bible says he was, the absolute ruler of ancient Israel, including all of the territory disputed in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict? The minimalist camp was quick to argue that the structure could date from the independent Jewish kingdom of the first 2 centuries before the Common Era. That's some 8 centuries after King David. But deep inside the great stone structure, Mazar found Phoenician-style ivory inlays and other imported luxury goods dating exactly to the time frame of David and Solomon. As the dig continued, so did the controversy surrounding it. For some time, progress was limited by 3 families, one Muslim, one Christian, and one Jewish, living in houses where Mazar would have most liked to explore. At the heart of the issues is the fact that the dig was initiated not in Jewish West Jerusalem, but in the Arab neighborhood of Silwan, in Arab East Jerusalem. That's just over the Green Line in an area considered part of what the Palestinian Authority wants to be the capital of the future Palestinian state. Elad points out that many of the homes in Silwan originally belonged to Jewish families who were expelled in the wake of a series of Arab riots in 1936. In spite of the fragile status quo in Jerusalem, Elad began acquiring property in Silwan in a number of ways. It took legal remedies to return Jewish land to its original owners. It bought various Arab properties on behalf of Jews and began construction of new housing as well. Most controversially, it utilized Israel's absentee property law to take control of homes declared vacant. The late Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor and noted humanitarian, praised the activities of Elad and served on his public council. The logic was simple. Jews should not be prohibited from living anywhere they wish, and Jerusalem should never again be divided. Meanwhile, peace activists and the international community at large have condemned Israeli settlement activity in Arab East Jerusalem. Make no mistake, the excavations elicited controversy within Israel as well. The government of Israel, of course, treads carefully around anything that might exacerbate the fragile status quo in the region, such as digging up a volatile area. And many among the academic community have charged that archaeology should never, under any circumstances, be mixed with political motives, such as those held by the Israeli settlers. Archaeology is a science, not an agenda. Furthermore, shouldn't archaeology be exclusively funded by the government, not some private entity? That, of course, involves money that's by necessity raised through taxation. But what if, as a taxpayer, you have no interest in archaeology? Never mind, you're paying for it anyway. A privately funded dig, by contrast, faces no such ethical dilemmas. Raise as much money as you like, spend it however you like, as long as you make your investors happy. As for the Palestinian side, it's not in their interest to admit the presence of the palace of King David smack in the heart of Arab East Jerusalem. That, of course, is also a political motive. To be honest, maybe the motives of Elad are tainted and the conclusions overblown. Perhaps digging for David amounts to much ado about nothing. Maybe this isn't David's palace after all. But what if it is? Doesn't that make it one of the most important archaeological sites ever excavated? Doesn't it deserve to be excavated? And if Elad didn't do it, who would? And look what Elad, as a private concern, has done with the site. It may be a tourist trap, but it's a beauty. At the entrance to the site is an ornately carved harp, reminding us of the great king's musical gift. And in conjunction with the municipality of Jerusalem, they've developed a whole archaeological park, bringing a new wave of tourism into the city. It's been charged that a number of Palestinian Arab residents of the area have been evicted in order to make way for the park. The mayor of Jerusalem argued to the contrary, that the area was basically run down and basically a slum, that the Palestinians in question had been living there illegally, and that they would be resettled in much better accommodations. In the United States, for example, there are eminent domain laws by which private property owners are required to surrender their homes for fair compensation for the greater public good. Is not uncovering the ancient house of David the greater public good, not just for Jews, but for Christians, Muslims, and whoever reveres the memory of the great biblical king? And isn't the economic development of a city in everyone's interest? It's also asked, what will become of Jerusalem's economic well-being if the city is in fact divided and walls and borders go up across most of its holy sites? Governmental agencies are also subject to the constraints of bureaucracy, which often means delay, mismanagement, waste, and inaction. that doesn't obscure the fact that a private concern like Elad has its own deficiencies to deal with, such as making claims that can't be substantiated in order to generate public interest. One spokesman for the excavation went as far as to insist that the biblical patriarch Abraham would have been exactly at this site. That's hardly a claim that good archaeology can substantiate. In fact, it's been counterclaimed that not a single artifact has surfaced linking either King David or his son Solomon with the structures uncovered in the excavation. But Israeli archaeologist Eilat Mazar begs to differ. In fact, a second phase of the excavation was underway by February 2007 and revealed that the well-known stepped stone structure was much larger than originally thought, with walls up to 20 feet thick. This structure had long been a recognizable feature of East Jerusalem, and some had tried to link it with the edifice known in the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles as the Milo, built by King Solomon, but never defined as to what it really was. Some archaeologists even thought that it might have been built by the ancient Jebusites, from whom David originally conquered the city. But we now know that the structure was part of a truly massive royal complex, dating to a time that would place it exactly within the lifespans of David and his son Solomon. We still can't definitively say that David or Solomon lived here, as our minimalist friends repeatedly point out. But if they didn't, who did? Moreover, a palace of this size doesn't befit a small fiefdom. It's characteristic of the headquarters of a regional power. What we have here is an example of Bible and artifact coming together almost seamlessly. And the discoveries continued. During the 2012 excavation season, Mazar came upon what might be ancient Jerusalem's earliest alphabetic text, dating to the 11th or 10th centuries before the Common Era. It may indicate surprisingly widespread literacy during the days of David and Solomon. Today, the bulk of the excavations in the city of David have been completed, but there are still plans afoot to dig in the most sensitive parts of Jerusalem. Beneath the old city and its polyglot, multi-ethnic quarters, there are plans to restore the true ancient city underneath the one visible to the eye. We can call it Jerusalem 2.0, underground. Down there, no stones are thrown, no rubber bullets are fired. The only light is artificial. But the controversies surrounding all of this and what Elad has already done to the area are all too real. Perhaps that's because Jerusalem is today, as it has always been, a focal point of geopolitics. From the days in which David first vanquished the Jebusites, it's been attacked 52 times, captured and recaptured 44 times, besieged 23 times, and destroyed twice. Ironically, we'd be hard-pressed to find any place on earth more prone to violence and bloodshed than this city of peace. The fact that subterranean archaeology is on the front line in today's conflict is but a new wrinkle in the ongoing battle for David. For better or for worse, the diggers will continue to dig, and that's the way it is. Israel's greatest modern poet, the late Yehuda Amichai, summed it up.
ירושלים היא כמו העיר אטלנטיס, שטבעה בים, הכל טבע בה ושקע בה. זו ירושלים של מטה, מן המטה, ומן הקרקעית מעלים כתלים חרבים, ושברי דתות, כמו כלים מאוניות נבואה שטבעו, מכוסי חלודה. זו לא חלודה, זה דם שלא יבש מעולם.